Good morning. Apparently when it's cold outside, we don't talk as long. I don't know. Your vocal cords need warming up or what's going on. Glad you're here this morning. Glad you made it. This week, how's everybody's week been? Everybody doing okay? Oh, wow. Some people are pumped about this week. It's a really good week. Others of you, maybe it's been a little crazy. I don't know. If you've been following our family history here, our disaster that we've been in the middle of. So 6 weeks ago, my son got a concussion because his parents don't love him and they don't watch him and stuff. And so he got a concussion. Then after that, that's been about 2 weeks of him throwing up and the whole thing with all the fun that comes with that. And then right after that, he got an ear infection in both ears. Then he passed that double ear infection to his sister, which was cool. And so she then started the next week with her ear infection. His didn't go away. The next week we were in the hospital with my son because his ear never got better and it got worse. So we were in the hospital. And last week we were out of the woods. We did it. Like we all survived and we had a head count and everybody was still there. And I was like, we are the people who on the Oregon Trail made it. Dysentery did not win. We forded a couple rivers and still made it. Like we are here. We did it. And Sunday night last week, my daughter comes to us and she's like, I think I want to lay down. And we're like, she's not that kid. She doesn't want to lay down ever. She's like, and also I need a blanket. I'm like, oh no. And then sure enough, that night she starts running a fever. And then the fever just elevated, and like by Monday night, she was running a fever that was like 103.7, 103.9, and she starts hallucinating. She's seeing things that were pretty exciting, but I also hope that nobody ever offers her our drugs, because it was also a little terrifying. I mean, some of the things she was seeing were a little scary to all of us, and so we've also had we've had her exercised, and we think we're on the right track. And the sickness has, fortunately, it seems like we're on the upswing. And so 6 weeks of just this mania of just this happening over and over again. And finally, Marie looks at me and she's like, Kevin, she goes, like when Marie was sick on Monday morning, she goes, Kevin, I'm so tired of this. And she was like, and I was like, well, do you want to sell at least one of the kids? Like, we've been talking about this for a long time. That's why you have two. So you have an extra. And I was like, I'm sure we can always make more if we need to. And she was like, no, I don't think so. And she said, but she goes, I'm starting to think this is like spiritual. Like I'm starting to wonder if we're being like attacked because this is getting exhausting. And every week we think we're done and we're not quite done. And so she did what she does every time. And if you know my wife, if you've been around, she did one of the things she does almost every time something like this happens, or any small thing really. Marie picks up her phone and she texts like a massive group of people and tells them to be praying for us. Now that, just so you know, that may not seem like a big heroic act. It may not seem like a big deal that she pulls out a phone and texts people to pray. That might not seem like a huge issue. Maybe you do that all the time. Maybe you don't. And maybe you even think, this is such a menial thing. Why are we even bothering other people with praying for this issue? Like maybe you think that way. I think that way sometimes. There are moments where Marie will tell me like, hey, be praying about this or that. And I'm thinking, is that even worth the time? And I really think, it's a confession from a pastor. There's moments where I'm like, I don't even know if that's a big enough deal. And then there's moments where I think it almost feels like a sign of weakness, right? I don't know if you've been around churches or whatever, there's almost like a stigma that comes with people asking to be prayed for. I don't know if you ever noticed this. But there's almost like a feeling of like, well, I don't want to burden other people with that. That's one thought. But two is like, then you're like being needy. Or you're being a little bit attention-seeking, or it's just not a big deal. You just need to get over it. Prayer is not the answer. You just need more cough meds or whatever. Anybody had this happen? Like there's a little bit of this stigma that goes with that, especially, and to be honest with you, especially as a pastor. Our job is to never show weakness. Our job is that we've always got our lives together, and we're showing you how perfect our lives are. If you've been around us long enough, you know that the Stampers are not that exhibit A of having our lives together all the time. But this is actually a stigma in ministry. It's a part of what we're supposed to do. Today, I want to look at a story where we see Jesus completely flip that on its ear, where that idea of prayer becomes something that is not just like wanted or not just a nice additive, but it is a necessity. It's something he's begging for. We're in this series about tribe, and we're looking at Jesus and his disciples, his 12 followers, the moments that he spends specifically with them. But then inside of this 12, today, we're going to look at him just with 3. And last week we looked at these 3. I am going to warn you right now, chronologically in the life of Jesus, this week and next week we're going to be out of order. We're going to go kind of back and then forth, and it's kind of a mess, and I apologize for that. I'm not sure why I decided to do that. I think I literally just wrote the series down in this order, and then I was like, that's what I'm going to do, and didn't think about the chronological order of that, because I'm a genius. And so today we're going to talk about this one, and then next week we'll go back and we'll kind of fill in the blanks on something that happens before this. But the reason I wanted to kind of have these 2 together is because these are the moments that Jesus really pulls away with just 3 disciples. So what we see is at this moment, what Jesus is going through is as his life goes, there's like almost this progression of Jesus getting more and more and more followers, and then less and less and less followers. So Jesus, as he begins ministry, he goes and he finds the 3 who are Peter, James, and John, and kind of their families. Then he adds to that number, and he goes from the 3 and really about the first 6, he adds 12. And from 12, he adds actually about 72 followers. When Jesus is at kind of the height of his ministry, there's moments where he's at 72 followers. Then there's moments that we know he's about 300 followers, which doesn't sound like a lot, but he has about 300 followers. There's moments where he's impacting thousands of people, but about 300 people are following Jesus around. And then, as Jesus gets towards the end of his earthly life, as he's about to be crucified, we see a peak moment where he rides into Jerusalem. If you know this story, he rides into Jerusalem, he's on a donkey, and all these people come out. Thousands of people come out, and they lay palm branches down, and they lay down robes. And he's at like the peak of his ministry, and they're saying to him, save us. You're the Savior we need. You're the King we need, because Israel needs a king. And they're saying, you're our King. You're the one who can save us. And from that moment, the next week that happens, Jesus' followers diminish and diminish and diminish and diminish. And he even tells them, he says, you're going to leave me all alone. I'm going to be by myself. By the end of this time, you're all going to fall away. Now, part of that could be because Jesus is prophesying you're all going to fall away and it's a prophecy. But my bet is not that Jesus is using some kind of supernatural power to know they're going to fall away. My bet, this is just my guess, is that Jesus isn't saying that because he's using some kind of prophecy or some kind of supernatural power to say you're all going to fall away from me. But my guess is that he's saying it because he just knows the human heart. He just knows that we're pretty fickle. Like we just kind of come and go as it's convenient for us a lot of times, right? And when it's best for us, we'll stick around. When it's not best for us, we won't. And he knows that we're fickle and we're fleeting and that our hearts really can't be trusted. And I'm guessing that what he's seeing here is that you're going to all fall away, not even because it's prophetic, not even because it's going to say that in the scripture, but just because I know how you're wired. I know how you operate. And in this last week of Jesus' life, he goes from a pinnacle moment, and all of a sudden people do. They just start falling away, and less are around him. And so where we're going to pick up today, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 26. And it's just these are fun numbers here. Matthew 26, verse 36, going through verse 46. So Matthew 26, 36, going through 46, okay? So we're going to be in Matthew 26, and we're going to look at this story of Jesus and really the smaller part of his disciples and just the 3. And really what I want to look at today is a couple things. Really, when we talk about prayer and we talk about people praying for us, when we talk about how important this is, I want to ask just a couple questions. One is, who are your people? And secondly, how? How are we praying? How does it work that we're praying? And I want to look at those 2 things as we go through this understanding of Jesus through the lens of his disciples. So what's happening right here, again, we've just left Jesus coming out of this big moment, riding in on a donkey. After that, he goes into a temple, he throws tables over, he gets mad at everybody, and then he yells and stuff, and that's like where Jesus gets, like, angry Jesus happens. And then angry Jesus leaves, and a little bit later, he's sitting down at dinner with his disciples, and we're going to talk about that next week. He's sitting down with the 12. So remember, we've gone from massive crowds to the 12 sitting in this room together, and now we're about to see him parse it down even more. So Matthew 26 is what it says, right at the beginning of verse 20 or 36 there. So it says, then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. So he leaves the upper room. He's with them. And he takes them to another place. Now, this means all the disciples. This means all 12. All 12 go with him. Probably all but one, because one is about to betray him. Judas is about to betray him. But the rest of the disciples come with him. This is him and all of his boys. Remember, Jesus handpicked these disciples. He went through a process of finding them. He's trusted them, and for 3 years, they have spent life so intimately together. They know every detail of one another because they have spent so much time together. Those disciples would have left their wives, would have left their homes, would have left their families, and just been devoted to 100% following a rabbi like Jesus. And to this day, this still happens. This practice still happens all over the world. But rabbis take on disciples, and those disciples leave everything they own and everything they know to follow their rabbi. And Jesus is their rabbi. They have spent so much time together, and Jesus takes all those disciples to a place. And things are about to come to a head, and he knows this. And so he takes them to this place called Gethsemane. Now, Gethsemane is a fascinating word picture that's happening here, because Gethsemane is a place that would have been a mountain. It was a Mount of Olives, and sometimes you'll see it called the Mount of Olives. But the word Gethsemane is a two-part word, Geth and Semene. The Geth part comes from a Greek word, or actually a Hebrew word, that was translated into Greek that means olive. And the second part, Semene, comes from, a Hebrew word that's translated into Greek, which means press. What this place was they would take olives and they would press them. They would put them into an olive press in this place. And they would create olive oil. That's what was happening on this mountain. Interesting word picture if you're thinking about what Jesus is about to go into. Jesus is supposed to be this king who's riding in, who's this king who's saving the world, and everybody's looking for a king for this kingdom. And he goes to a place that's going to literally, where he's going to be crushed, where he's going to be squeezed, where he's going to be completely broken. And he goes to a place where this happens. Now, what's interesting, too, is a king would also be anointed as a king with oil. That was a normal practice, right? We still kind of see this in prayer circles. We anoint one another with oil, but if you still pay attention to royal ceremonies in England, have you noticed this? The royals, they still get oil put on their heads. That's a way to anoint a king to this very day. And it's interesting because he's going to the place where the oil would come from for him to be a king. But he's saying, it's not because I'm just going to be anointed with it, but because I'm going to be crushed for it. It's a different kind of kingdom. It's different than what you're used to. It's an upside-down kingdom. And in fact, I'm going to let the Romans think they've won and that their kingdom is now destroying ours. But what's going to happen is in 3 days after that, I'm going to rise from the dead and show that my kingdom was never of this world and never will be. And I'm a king who's been anointed because I've been crushed for you. So he goes to Gethsemane. That's where he shows up. And the pressure, you can feel the pressing in on him as he knows what's about to happen. You can feel this tension. You can feel this pressure happening. And he says to them, so he says to all the disciples, this is what he says to all the 11 or 12 that are with him at this moment. He says to them, sit here while I go over there and pray. So, which is kind of great. Like, Jesus is like, I'm going to go do the big kid work. You guys just hang out here. Like, you guys aren't great at this yet. Maybe they weren't good prayers yet. I don't know. Maybe they were still stuck on the rhyming prayers, if you will, like the God's neat, let's eat type of prayers, the rub-a-dub-dub, thanks for the grub. And he was like, you guys stay here, okay? You just sit here, sit tight. I'm going to go pray. You guys just let the big kids do the big kid work here. And so but then it says in the next verse, in 37, it says, he took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him. So notice he leaves them there, the 12, and he takes just 3. And he takes Peter and James and John. The sons of Zebedee, again, would have been the sons of thunder, as we know them. They would have been 2 brothers, James and John, James the Greater, and John, who writes the book of John, and probably Revelations. Those guys go with him. And they, again, what we just saw before this, if you remember last week, we talked about what they saw. Those guys were with Jesus when he was transfigured. There was the same group. Just those 3 were with Jesus when he was at his best. at this peak moment, right? Jesus goes and he's transfigured, and you see the glory of God in him. He starts glowing. He starts talking to Moses and Elijah. He's at his best. He trusts those guys enough to see him at his most glorious, and now he's going to trust them to see him at his lowest. Right? As Marilyn Monroe once said, if you can't handle me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best. As Vin Diesel, I think, said, is if you can't handle me at my fastest, you can't handle me at my furiousest. That's probably not a real Vin Diesel quote. I don't think he says words. He just grunts. That's what he's saying here. So there's this moment where he trusts these guys differently than everybody else. The only two moments they pull away with just these three and Jesus, it is the greatest moment possibly of Jesus' entire life on earth and the lowest moment of Jesus' life on earth. And he pulls them away, just them. And notice this, as soon as it says that he took them with him, and at that time he began to be sorrowful and troubled. So it doesn't mean that he was showing this to everybody. When he was even with the 12, not all 12 of them may have seen him sorrowful and troubled, but as soon as he gets away with just his boys, just his closest people, all of a sudden that's when you start to see him break down. That's when he starts to show the emotion that's going on within him. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? He doesn't show it to everybody. In fact, I would actually say, I think we usually have this picture of Jesus like always being kind of sorrowful. Like he just always looks so somber and stoic, and it looks like he's just a robot with flesh on. I mean, it looks terrible. I believe that Jesus, for the most part, was actually a very happy guy. A lot of what he says is very sarcastic and it's kind of funny. The stories he tells are ridiculous. Like people would have enjoyed being around Jesus. I think for the most part, Jesus was actually a very joyful guy, and then all of a sudden he pulls away though, and this is where the first time we see him, and he becomes sorrowful and he becomes troubled. And it says right after that, it says, then he said to them, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. I mean, put yourself in this story for just a second. If you can put yourself in this garden. And the person that you've trusted as a teacher, a person you've trusted as a confidant, a person who you've looked up to, a person that you spent 3 years just following so closely, if they looked at you, and they said these words, my soul is overwhelmed to the point of death, what would that do in your heart? How would you take that? I mean, how could you sit idly by when they tell you this? How could you sit to the side? What you'd want to get in, wouldn't you? You want to do something and say, like, let's fix this. Let's handle this. And then all he says for them is to stay here and keep watch with me. Again, the bar is set very low. All he's asking for is for them to sit and keep watch with him. I don't know if you've ever been around people who are like in a mourning type of place, where they're in a grieving or sorrowful place. I know many times I've been into rooms where people are like, if I ever visit you in the hospital, and I hope I don't have to, but when I do this, like this is always an interesting moment for me. Because I remember being trained when I was younger in ministry, that here's how you enter a hospital room. When somebody's like in a place of grief or mourning, or they themselves are in pain, you enter the room and you handle it. Like you're the one in control. You let them know that everything's going to be okay, and you're going to pray for them, and everything's going to work out. You give them all the hope you can. And I believe there's hope to be given. I believe there's good things to be given. But I've also been in many rooms myself that I'm so bad about it. I'm terrible at it. I'm like a disaster. I remember when one of the families here in the church, they had a car accident a couple years ago, and it was horrific. It was on Highway 19, and they were just sitting at a stoplight in a small car, and their daughter was in the back seat. They were just sitting there, and it was a stoplight, and a Ford F-150 just came at about 55 miles an hour with no brakes right into the back of their little car. And it smashed the car, and the driver, he went into the steering column to the point where it broke all of his ribs. And mom was somewhat okay in the passenger seat, but their daughter was in the back seat, and her leg was absolutely crushed into the seat in front of her. I mean, it was in pieces. And I remember walking into a hospital room to go see them. And their daughter was just laying there. It was just about an hour after the accident. She was laying there, and she had her leg just like all in pieces, and she was laying on the bed, and the mom was standing with her, and mom was just crying. And I walked in, I looked at her on the bed, and I was supposed to be in control. I was supposed to tell them that everything's okay, that I'm praying for them, it's all going to work out. And I just lost it. I thought, that my little girl's about that age. What if that was can you imagine what they're going through right now? Can you feel that pain? And I just started crying. And the mom came over and just stood with me, and we just cried for like a while. If you know me, that's not my typical situation. I'm not a crier. And I told her, I said, I'm so sorry. I meant to come in here and comfort you and all these things. And she said, that's exactly what you just did. Sometimes you just want somebody who sits with you, who just stays here and keeps watch. That's all Jesus is asking for. He's asking them to just be here with him in this time of sorrow. And they're going to miss it. Stay here and keep watch with me. That's all he's asking for. Now, it says then, a little bit later, so right after that, he leaves them there. He says, you stay and keep watch. So he's left the 12 at one part, he's left the 3 at another, and now he's going to go pray. And it says, going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed. Now, just so you know, this statement right here, this is the first time and the only time in the New Testament we see Jesus praying from a different position. In Jesus' day, there was only one way to pray. Rabbis especially, they had their prayer cloth or their cloak. If you're not familiar with that, they had tassels on each side that had the 613 laws represented in the tassels, and they would learn those laws, and they would tie the knots in these tassels to remind them of all the laws. Then they would stand, and they would close this cloak, and that was called their prayer closet. Jesus talks about going into your prayer closet and praying. Now, many of them would stand right on a street corner. Not everybody had like their own homes or big places to go to pray. They would stand on the street corners, and they would just close the cloth, and they would pray right there. But you stood to pray. It was a sign of reverence. And usually, we have this idea that you kneel, or that you bow your head, you close your eyes, right? Everybody learned that at some point, right? But Jesus, in his day, you also were taught that you looked to heaven to pray. You looked up. This is Jesus breaking all the traditions. And he falls down on his face. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I pray, there are certain things that I think I have to do to make God happy, right? Like, if anybody, again, if you fold your hands, it's like 10 points. Like, it's like a 10% chance higher that your prayer is going to get answered, right? I mean, maybe you feel that if you fold your hands, or if you speak in King James English, and suddenly, like, it's a lot of thou arts, and, or if you say Abba Father a lot, like those kind of things. And suddenly you're speaking a language you've never spoken before, but you're saying it because that's going to, again, it's like a 20% amplifier that your prayer is going to get answered. Or if you kneel, some of us are like, again, if you think you kneel, then you're like, okay, this is getting better. Like, God's got to hear me now because I'm kneeling, doing everything right. If you Tebow, 100% chance. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. You know you have to ask Tim Tebow to pray for you. That's how it works. If you pray in a circle and you squeeze hands at the end, that's negative 5 points because it's weird. We all know that there's these things that you're supposed to do, right? You're supposed to go through all the rituals. Jesus breaks all the traditions right here, and he falls flat on his face, showing us it's not about the actions you're taking. It's not about some kind of efficiency of actions. It's about the urgency of your heart. That prayer is not some kind of efficiency of action, saying the right things, doing the right things, just getting all the words in the right places. It's not about your actions, it's not about your words, it's not about all having it all together. In fact, prayer is most effective when you don't have it all together. I think it's so fascinating because so many of us, we like rationalize this, and because we're rational humans, right? Have you ever had this thought where you're like, I should ask somebody to pray for me, like maybe after service, or maybe when you're with some other people, or maybe you're around a pastor you know or somebody that you trust, and you're like, I should ask them to pray for me, but then you're like, no. Like, probably not, because it's not that big a deal yet. If it gets worse, I'll ask for prayer. Or, like, the moment I can't quite handle it as well, that's when I'll ask. Anybody have this? I mean, be honest here. There's those moments where you're like, I should probably ask people to be praying about this thing, but I'll wait till it gets, like, bad. It's not bad yet. And we have, like, this idea that there's, like, all these things we have to go through, that when we get it cleaned up and we do it right, that's when we'll have people pray for us. That's not how this works. One of my friends, he's a pastor, and he was in Rome one time on a trip, and he happened to be in Rome. He was at the Vatican. He was staying outside the Vatican. And he was staying there, and it happened to be a week that Mother Teresa was in town in Rome from Calcutta, and she was going to be in the church that day. She was at the Vatican. And he was like, and of course, this is big news. Like, when Mother Teresa shows up somewhere, it's a big deal. And he was like, so he was really excited to go see her, but he was pretty jet lagged. And so he went to sleep. And the next morning when the service was supposed to start very early, and he was going to get up and go to the mass to see her. And so he got up a little bit late, and he realized, like, I'm running late. And he was kind of in a bad situation. In Rome, he was staying far enough away that, he could have taken a car, but then he thought, no, I'll just run there because it'll be faster than trying to get a car. So he starts running down the streets of Rome this is why Americans have a bad reputation in other countries. So he starts running as fast as he can down the streets of Rome. He gets towards the Vatican. He gets there. He gets into the cathedral. And right when he walks into the cathedral, Mother Teresa is on the move. And when Mother Teresa moves through a building, she had a massive posse. There was people everywhere with her. And she started walking down one of the aisles, and she came right towards him. And he just happened to be standing there as he walked in the door. And she walked right past him through the door he was in. And when she saw him, she looked at him, and she said a phrase that he did not understand because it was in a different language. She said this one phrase, and then she left. And he asked somebody who was standing near him, does anybody know what she just said? And one person told him, she looked at you and she said, pray for me. Now, he felt a lot of pressure. So I'm supposed to pray for Mother Teresa. That's what I'm supposed to do right now, is pray for her. Are her prayers not effective or enough? Is she not closer to Jesus than all of us ever will be? What's the formula on this? And so he kind of said to somebody, he said to the person who was talking to him, he said, that's a lot to handle. I'm supposed to pray for her. And the person said, no, that's what she says to everyone. See, for Mother Teresa, prayer wasn't some kind of last resort. Prayer was a first option every time. She wasn't waiting for the wrong circumstance, for something to fall apart, for something to get worse. It wasn't her last resort. For so many of us, I think prayer is our last resort. For me, even, there are moments, again, that I think, I don't need to pray about that. That's not a huge deal. Because I'm waiting for it to all come together. And then there's going to be a moment where I'll have this big moment of prayer. And what we learn is that it's not this last resort, it's a first option. And for Jesus, the great thing we see with Jesus is that he made this a first priority all the time. This wasn't the only time he prayed. This wasn't just the one time. He had this relationship with God that was ongoing. And therefore, it was what was on his heart. The urgency of his heart wasn't going to be blocked by the right actions, or waiting for the right words to come, or going through the right formulas. He wasn't going to wait for those things. He was going to talk to God about what was on his heart. So many times I think we get stifled by the things we think we have to go through, or the means we have to pray, instead of realizing we have to make it a first option, not some kind of last resort. We have to do it now, not wait for it. Today we're going to take some time in a little bit here, and I'm going to ask you can come up and pray. There's going to be people up here, and I just want to make that full disclosure. I think this is an important thing for us to learn, is that we don't wait on these things to build up or get worse. Prayer should be the first thing we do every time. And so Jesus, he falls on his face. And then he says, Father, if it is possible. Now, notice this, there's a small difference here. But he says, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. Now, he says, if it's possible. So he starts with, if it is possible. Like, please do this. If it's possible, may this cup be taken from me. The cup represents like something terrible, honestly. What we see is in Greek culture especially, the cup, anybody watch Hunger Games? It's a great film, based on true stories. It was a documentary about people running out of food. And but there's a moment in that where there's like the President Snow or somebody like that is supposed to go and he has to eat the poison berries. They're in a cup and he's supposed to eat them himself. Anybody remember this? This is actually like based on history. This isn't just like a fun thing. Socrates, who was one of the greatest philosophers of all time, Socrates was a Greek, and actually he was forced to drink a cup of poison himself, and that's how he died. He was forced to take a cup and drink the poison, and that's how he died. Jesus, this idea of a cup is like literally, it's like something where it's like, this is the heaviest thing, this is the worst thing, this is probably going to kill you. And he's saying, this cup, if that's what I have to have, can it please be taken from me? I don't want it. It's interesting right here. This is a really interesting moment, by the way, that Jesus and God aren't quite on the same page. Like there's a difference of opinion here. And first, I think sometimes we have this idea that we're not allowed to like fight with God in prayer, and I think that's not true. I think God loves to have these conversations. And keeping the conversation going is the most important thing. And he says, this cup, please let it be taken from me. Now, again, he says, if it is possible. We'll come back to that in a second. He says, but yet not as I will, but as you will. So he says this, but then it says right after that in verse 40, he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Thanks a lot, guys. It's good to have a good support system, isn't it? He goes back and they are sleeping, like they're out. He has just told them, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, and they're sleeping. They're not worried about it. They're out. They're sleeping. They are not paying attention. And he shows up, and it says that he finds them sleeping, and he says to them, could you men not keep watch with me for 1 hour? He asked Peter, like, just give me 1 hour. That's all I'm asking for. Pray for be awake for 1 hour. That's all I'm asking for. Could you not do that for me? He's saying, like, right now I need you. This is when I need you, right now in this moment. And you're falling down on the job. I don't know if you've ever done this. Again, this is a confession as a pastor. Maybe I'm not allowed to tell you this. Have you ever had that moment where you're talking to somebody and they say something terrible going on in their lives, and then you go, I'll pray for you. And then you walk away from that conversation and you never think of it again. Anybody do this? I know I'm the only one. I know. I'm the only person who's ever done this. Like it happens all the time, right? You say, I'll pray for you, or that sounds difficult. I'll be praying for you. And then you walk away and you forget all about it, and then you feel terrible. I mean, it's one thing that I love about like the Connect cards that are on your seat. That's why we do that, is so you can write down prayer requests on those so that I don't leave this place and forget about them. On Tuesdays, we are dedicated to praying for those things and praying for you. But sometimes, I mean, let's be honest, we have that happen. Maybe you've had that happen. I've tried to kind of change my philosophy on this, because what we're seeing here is this is an urgent moment. This matters right now. And so some of you have had this happen, and I know it makes you uncomfortable, because some of you tell me, like, hey, Kevin, this is going on in my life, and I'm like, well, let's pray right now. And some of you are like, oh, I didn't mean that. Pray another time, not with me here, because this is weird. And that's not my philosophy. Like, I'm just going to, if you want me to pray for you, I'm going to do it now. I'm not going to wait. Because I will forget and it won't happen, and I don't want to do that. If it's urgent to pray about at all, it's urgent to pray about now. If there's something in your life that's urgent to pray about at all, it's urgent to pray about right now. Don't wait for it, do it now. And so some of you have had that uncomfortable pleasure where you're like, hey, we've got this thing going on this week, and I'll be like, well, let's pray about it. And you're like, well, okay, I guess we're going to pray now. How do I do this again? He's saying, I needed you now. Don't fall asleep on me. I need you right now to be praying for this. Could you not even stay awake for 1 hour? And then he says to Peter, he says, watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, as we sang earlier today. The spirit is willing, but the body, the flesh, is weak. Pray that you will not fall into temptation. Now, this temptation is very confusing. That word there in Greek is a word that actually means, it means more like a trial or like a test. That you're not going to fall into trials. You're not going to have things tested and proved. And so that's what he means there when he says that, is that this might be like a trial you're going to go through. And I would wonder what that temptation is. What is Jesus talking about right here when he says this? And I think we get an answer in just a little bit. Because the next thing it says is Jesus then went away, and he went away a second time and prayed. Now notice this, the second time, remember the first prayer, he said, if it is possible, have the cup taken away. Notice the second time what he says. There's only one word different, but it's a big difference. And he says, in the second time, in verse 42, it says he went away and prayed a second time, and it says, my Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. If it's not possible, do you see Jesus is starting to have a different stance on this whole thing. It went from if it's possible to if it's not possible. Maybe we're not gonna fully give up on that thing. Maybe God, you're still gonna hold on to that thing tightly. And if you are, then notice what he's doing. He's not changing God's mind, he's changing his own mind. He's saying, okay, if it's not possible, okay, I'm starting to understand here, God. I'm starting to get the full picture here. I'm getting the perspective that you have, which is much greater than the perspective I have. I'm understanding the full story here because I continue to pray to you. But remember, the disciples did not continue to pray. They did not continue this conversation with God, and they're going to miss out on something really big. Because it says the very next verse in verse 43, when he came back again, he found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They're having that moment like where you're trying to stay awake. Some of you are doing it right now. Where you're trying to stay awake and you're keeping your eyes are like fluttering and they're rolling back in your head just a little bit. You know what I'm talking about? They're doing this. Their eyes are heavy. So he left them and went away again once more and prayed for a third time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour is near, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise and go. Let us go. Here comes my betrayer. So here's the moment. It's all coming together. This is the moment that this will all happen. Now, here's what we have to ask ourselves. So in this story, why are they there? Like, again, we asked this last week. With Peter, James, and John, why does Jesus bring them here? Why are they there? Why are they in this spot? Because let's face it, if Peter and James and John were praying, let's say that they were praying the whole time, they weren't sleeping, do you think that somehow God would have changed his mind because Jesus had more people praying for him? And the whole redemption plan that's been laid out for thousands of years, since the beginning of time, will suddenly be put on pause because this doofus Peter and James and John are speaking up now. Is that what we think? Like, is that what's going to happen? God's like, oh, well, now you got 3 more people, so I'm going to change the whole plan. The whole plan's off. We'll do something else. I don't think that's what's going to happen. So why are they there? Why does Jesus want them praying? Why is he interested in that? I mean, my guess is there's got to be a reason that he wants them there still. And there's a reason he wants them awake and praying. And I don't think it's just for self-support. Jesus has it handled. He's got a better connection with God than anybody. I don't think it's like he's just like, well, you know what, guys? I just need my people right now, and I'm just having a tough time, and let's circle up and hold hands. I don't think that's what he's worried about. He can handle himself. Why are they there? What is going on? Last week I told you about a friend of mine. I promise I have other friends, but I had a friend named Brett who had cancer in his leg. And he was healed, and it was amazing. But I was in college. When I went to college a couple years later, I had another friend, and his name was Rodney. Rodney also had a similar situation. Like, I loved Rodney, and Rodney was a good guy, and to this day, I only eat pizza with, like, sausage and onions on it. I know that sounds disgusting, but the reason is because Rodney didn't like sausage and onions. And if you ordered a pizza to the dorm, Rodney was going to follow that pizza to your room, and then he would sit down, and he was such a nice guy, and he'd be like, hey, are you going to eat all that? I was like, that's why I ordered it, but then he'd be like, yeah, I could have a piece or something, and then you'd feel bad, he'd give him a piece. But he didn't like sausage and onion pizza, so I would only order sausage and onion pizza. I developed a liking for it. It's the only one you could eat the whole thing on. And so Rodney was like this really nice guy and just a great guy. He was a pastor in the area. He was going to school for ministry, just a great guy. And I remember when he started coming back to college at one point, we were playing intramural basketball together, and he started complaining about his back. Now, Rodney was a big dude. He actually was recruited to go play football at some Division I colleges. He was a big dude, but he decided he wanted to go into ministry instead. And so we played intramural sports together a lot, and at one point we were playing basketball, and he was like, my back hurts so bad. And he started sitting out the games, and I was like, and I gave him a hard time about it all the time, like, Rodney, you're being a weenie, just get back in there, it'll be fine. And he would say, no, it really hurts. And so finally one day he was driving home from Christmas break, or driving back to college from Christmas break. And he was on Highway 27, and there is a hospital just right off to the side, and he pulled into the hospital as he was driving to the college and just went in and said, I don't know what's going on. I'm in so much pain, I can barely move, I can barely sit. And they said, okay, we'll take you in. And they did x-rays, they did MRIs. And Rodney also was found with a mass of cancer on the upper part of his hip. And so they immediately told him, we will have to take your leg. Your leg is coming off. There's no way around it. And your life you may not have life either, but you're definitely not going to have a leg. And literally, I remember it was only about 2 weeks later that they took Rodney into an operating room, and they were going to take his leg off. And like, Rodney was like a good dude. He was a good person. And so we got together the night before this operation, and we went to a small church, and we decided to pray for Rodney. Rodney wasn't there. He had to stay in the hospital the whole time, but we got together to pray for him. And we went around this circle, we were all praying out loud for Rodney, and we spent a long time there. And I remember it got time for me to pray. And just full disclosure, I prayed the weakest prayer I think I've ever prayed. I prayed just the lamest prayer. My friend is about to lose his leg, and ultimately he did. He lost his life. And I prayed that God would just comfort him. That God would just be with him. And that was it. I fell down on the job. There are times I think you have to pray bold prayers and big prayers because our God is a big God, and you have to pray to the size of the God you believe in. And I prayed this weak little prayer. And then, you know what happened after that? He lost his leg, and after that, I gave up on praying. I was done. I was mad, and I just decided I'm out. And I gave up on praying for Rodney because I thought, you know what, you've already made up your mind, it doesn't matter anymore. Anyway. And I got so mad at God. And I was just done. Meanwhile, my friend Rodney, he prayed every single day. And Rodney, I kid you not, while he was going through chemo, while he lost his leg, he got married. In the meantime, he had about a year. He started working at a church still. He was a youth pastor the whole time. Did amazing things. Touched more lives in that short amount of time than I may ever get to be around in my life. I watched amazing things happen through him because he continued to pray. He continued to stay plugged into that. And here's what I think would have happened. Let's say that I prayed a stronger prayer. Let's say I would have stayed engaged in praying. Do you think it would have changed the outcome? Maybe not. I doubt it. Because the point of prayer sometimes is not about changing God's mind. It's about changing our hearts. Sometimes praying is not about trying to fix God's ideas or his will. It's about fixing what's broken in us. And I think what Jesus is saying, the temptation he's talking about with Peter, is saying, you're going to fall away. You're about to deny me 3 times. You're about to fall away. And why you're here to pray is not to change God's mind, but it's to change your heart in the midst of these circumstances. It's to change the way you see these things, for you to get the perspective you need, for you to have the God who is a sounding board and the God who loves you still walking by your side and not to turn that off and walk away from it. I think it's one of the hardest truths of prayer, because what we want prayer to be is we do the formula and then God changes his mind. And maybe what prayer is there is no formula. That we go without the formula, but that through that experience, God changes our hearts in the midst of it. He changes who we are because of it. We know as followers of Jesus, things aren't easy. They don't get better. It's not like somehow everything's magically fixed. The benefit of following Jesus is that we have this rock, this relationship that we can go to. And I think so many times we're falling asleep on the job. We're falling asleep on the prayer that we're supposed to be praying. And in doing so, we're missing out on relationship. We're missing out on having our hearts changed, our identities changed, our mindset changed. Today, in this space, I want to just give us some time to do that, is to have your tribe, the people around you, who would pray for you. And maybe there's something that you're like, no, this is a big thing, or this is something that's not really a big deal. This is not the time for wait for a big deal. This is time to pray now and begin that conversation now. This is time to go ahead and deal with the thing that's going on in your heart right now. And so today, if there are things that are going on in your life, if there are things you want prayer about, we want to do that here. We don't want to leave here and wait for it to get worse or wait for something else to happen. That's not the goal. The goal is that we take care of it now, we pray about it now, and pray together as a church. And so in the room back there, because again, if you're nervous about like stigma of people seeing you or whatever, it's ridiculous. Just that's not an issue. But in the room back there, there's going to be some people back there who will be willing to pray with you. And Keith and Gary and John, and they'll be back there praying with you, and they'd love to be there. Janessa will be back there. I'll hang out back there too. And what we'd love to do is just pray with you. If there are things going on in your life, we don't want to walk out of here and miss the chance to pray about it now. And we don't want to walk out of this place hoping that somehow we miss the point and that we're somehow coming together just to change God's mind, although I think that can happen, and that's a whole other sermon for a whole other time. But we also want to have our hearts changed in the midst of this time. What you're walking through, we want our hearts to be changed, our viewpoints to be changed, our perspectives to be changed by talking to God about it. So we're going to sing, and we're going to, and you're welcome to go back and pray through this song, through the rest of this time, and we'll meet you back there. If you would, let's stand together, and let's pray. Jesus, I thank you for this time. I thank you for your word. I thank you for watching what the disciples go through to understand more about who you are. I pray today that if there are things in our lives that we need to deal with, God, that we would deal with them today. We wouldn't wait. I pray if there's things we need perspective on, we need a bigger picture on, that we would come to you right now. I pray if there's things in our lives that we've been waiting to come to you about, that we wouldn't wait today. We would just do it. We'd have the conversation we've been waiting to have with you. And God, we love you, and we know that you have plans. We know that you have purpose. We know that nothing that you do is out of place or out of accident. We know that everything you do has a place and has a purpose. And I pray that you would reveal to us what it is, that you would shape our hearts, shape our perspectives. We thank you for a place like this, for people around us, a community that loves us, willing to speak up, willing to pray on our behalf, willing to come alongside. And today I pray if there's thoughts in our minds of weakness or things where it's like, well, I don't need to pray about that, pray you would remove those things and allow us to be vulnerable and honest with the people around us. To be able to have the conversation we need to have the prayer happen that needs to happen, that we would lift one another up and lift our burdens up to you so that you can change our hearts in this process. Praise things in your name. Amen. You're welcome to head back to the room back there. If you'd like to pray, we'll be back there.